Welcome to the 300 After Hours, where we continue to talk about what we talked about at our weekly Bible study with the young adults, and we're still in Galatians, right? We'll be here a long time. We're not even out of the first chapter yet. So I have Angela here, Mason's beautiful wife, right? Woo! So thank you for joining me here tonight, Angela. So let me just, we're still in this section. All of chapter 1 is really a narrative. Paul is explaining the events surrounding his conversion, and that continues into part of chapter 2 as well. But he's doing that for the purpose of kind of validating that he is in fact a true apostle, and that his message did in fact come from God and not from men. And so in our last session, Paul was talking about the fact that he had no contact really with any leaders in the church. So he couldn't have got his message from them initially. For 3 years, he had no contact. And now in these verses today, verses 18 through 20, he's going to describe the limited contact that he did have when he first did meet some of the apostles and leaders. And this account is also going to show us how he really, even in that contact that he did have, how he really couldn't have got his understanding of the gospel from them, right? And so he says in verse 18, after 3 years, so he's converted, spends 3 years in Damascus and the Arabian desert. He says, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, who is Peter, and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. And then verse 20, he says, in what I'm writing to you before God, I do not lie. So in those 3 verses, what did you guys find interesting at your table or even personally?
Yeah. I thought it was kind of an interesting parallel that Paul was in the wilderness or in the desert for 3 years, and that's approximately the amount of time that Jesus spent with the disciples. And just, I don't know, just another reason of validation, I guess. And then I thought it was really interesting, the depth and understanding Paul has of hypocrisy and dishonesty, and that he really laid it out there for all of us, that he left no room for ignorance.
Okay.
Yeah. Ignorance is a choice. That to not choose is a choice against Christ. He really made that clear.
Yeah. He presses that issue in verse 20, right, at the end, when after he describes all this, and we'll talk about like some of these reasons why these events validate the fact that he's a true apostle and his message came from God, but he kind of pushes us to make a choice with him at the end there when he says, what I'm writing to you before God, I'm not lying about, right?
So it's so solid.
Yeah. So you do have to make a choice with Paul. I mean, he is putting his whole integrity and everything on the line. And because he says that, he makes it impossible for you to take a middle-of-the-road position with him, right? He either, is an apostle of Jesus Christ and did get his understanding of the gospel from God himself, or he's a liar.
Yeah.
And you probably shouldn't listen to him at all, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know at our table we kind of just mentioned the idea that you can't be kind of dead. You're either dead or you're alive. Yeah. You're either saved or you're not. And Paul does give us the opportunity to make that.
Jesus spoke with that kind of clarity. The Bible really deals with us with that kind of clarity, doesn't it? I mean, it doesn't allow us to kind of just float down the middle.
Yeah.
It is put together and it deals with us in such a way that we kind of have to make a choice to be on one side or the other of the commands of Scripture and what Scripture says. So we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but I want to kind of go through here the 4, we pointed out kind of 4 things that validated in Paul's account here of when he finally did go up to Jerusalem, 4 things that kind of make his point that he couldn't have gotten his message from the apostles. The first thing is the fact that it was 3 years before he went to Jerusalem, right? And do you remember what the point of that 3 years is? It's beyond just the fact that what you pointed out. You pointed out that we kind of see this 3-year model as kind of the length of Jesus' ministry. It's actually the length of time that Paul spent in Ephesus before he leaves and says, I didn't fail to declare to you the whole counsel of God. So it was about 3 years that it took him to do that. And so here we have 3 years again. It was a lot of time in the desert learning the doctrines or the gospel from God. How would that help to prove here? And what else do we point out about how that would help to prove that his message was not from men? Do you remember?
I think what you're looking for is the validation that we receive that his previous ideas and his later ideas were in unison. Is that what you're
Yes,
talking
that's
about?
exactly what I'm talking
Okay.
about. So if you go back to the Acts 9 account, Acts 9, yes, and you see his conversion, it describes, so in Galatians here, it describes the 3 years as just going into Arabia. But in the Acts account, you can see that that wasn't just all spent in the desert, that he's actually ministering through that time in and through Damascus in some respect. And so when he says, I got 3 years of ministry over there in and around Damascus while I was also learning in the desert, well, it allows us then to compare whatever he was saying through those years with what he was saying after he met the apostles.
Yep.
And if it changed, then that would undermine his claim that the message came from God,
Yeah.
right? It would be like, no, actually, you changed your story after speaking with the apostles, right? So that was one thing that we pointed out.
And that's what I mean, like with the hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Like he is fully aware that if he were to, he's making these strong claims that this is of God, this is about God, and that if any of this is false, if any of it wavers at all, then it is invalid.
Yeah.
It's a sham.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't catch that exact point that you were making. That I understand what you're saying now. Yeah. Yeah. That's powerful there. He goes on and he says, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him. What was the next thing we pointed out?
Well, I first thought it was weird because I read it and I was like, who is Cephas? So I had to do a little digging, but you also mentioned it's Peter.
It's Peter, right?
I'm sorry, what was your question?
Well, what is that? What do we see there in that next kind of thing? What is he saying there?
Oh, that he went to visit.
Right, he went to visit. It's
Not confirmed
he wasn't
doctrine.
going to the discipleship ministry school, right?
Yeah.
The On This Rock Seminary. He's going to visit, and you can see that in other translations that it will say like he went to get acquainted with. I think the NLT says. So he's saying, even when I did go, my point was not to learn doctrine.
Yeah.
I actually just wanted to get to know them and wanted them to get to know me, right? So he makes that point. What else do we see as we make our way through?
I think the next thing you mentioned was that he had only met with two specific people, Peter and James.
Yeah. So not only was he not going to talk theology, he only got acquainted with two people. Important people. Peter's really kind of the head of the apostles.
Yeah.
James, the brother of Jesus, is the head of the church in Jerusalem. So important people, but still only two people. It's not like he was, going around and having meetings with all of the various apostles. And what was the other thing we mentioned?
Last thing was that before he... wait, hold on. Oh, the last thing that he mentioned was that before he speaks, he's aware of his dishonest consequences, in a sense. Wait.
No. It's right after he remained with him for 15 days.
Oh, I think I wrote that.
Did you miss that one?
I missed that.
So the point was that not only was he just going for a visit, not to talk theology, but he only had access to two of the apostles, and he only had access to them, for 15 days.
Yeah, a short amount of time.
Short amount of time.
Sometimes I think this bit of scripture is really important because I can hear people talking in these fancy terminologies, fantastic doctrinal conversations. I can think, why can't I figure these things out? And it takes time.
Right.
I can't just figure them out in just a few short conversations or days. So
Right. Yeah. It actually does take time. I mean, you could get a general understanding of the gospel very quickly, right? In fact, right after you're converted, you would be able to testify on a certain level to that conversion and testify about Christ, right?
Yeah.
But there's I think I pointed out in the video, you don't ever listen to just an amazing sermon or someone who just kind of puts it all together is able to kind of talk about the whole narrative or the arc of redemptive history. He can talk about complex things that Paul talks about, like predestination and election. You never hear someone do that, a pastor or teacher, and then go, wow, that guy must have studied for 15 days, right?
Yeah.
Because you cannot get that kind of comprehensive understanding that Paul has
Yeah.
from a 15-day visit with Peter, right? And so, yes, that's kind of the final point that he's making. I have a testimony of my ministry for 3 years. You can compare what I was saying before my meeting and after, and you're going to see it's the same thing. When I did go to meet, I wasn't going to, a seminary. I went to visit them. I only saw 2 of them, and I only stayed with one of them for 15 days, right? And then that's when he comes in at the end and says, in all this, I'm not lying. And that's what really causes us to go, okay,
Yeah.
well, either you are or aren't. I mean, if you're not lying, then that had to have come from God.
Yeah.
Your understanding had to have come from God, right?
Mm-hmm.
So finally, how would this truth change like the way that you would live out your faith walk?
Yeah. I think at its face value, we mentioned that you have to make a choice. And so I have to actively walk in that choice. But as we were talking, I also considered a quote by Vodi Bakum that said that love is an act of the will accompanied by emotion that leads to action on behalf of its object.
Yep.
And I was thinking, like, how do I love God more and proceed with more reverence after reading this text? And at face value, it is not an emotional text. Because often we can think of love as a very emotional point of time. Or like, but it is being historical narrative. We can understand how Paul has given us the opportunity to enact out of our will, to make that choice. But then further, there is, beyond that, there is that emotional depth to it. That it is not just some, do I want ice cream or do I not? Like, this is a life or death situation. And that deep emotion is pretty beautiful.
Yeah. The Bible even beyond what Paul is saying here, we recognize that Jesus speaks of deep things and things that we must respond to. The Bible itself deals with us that way, doesn't it?
It does.
I mean, it really doesn't allow us. It doesn't speak in just like general, slogans or just words of wisdom that everyone wants on their coffee cup or something. I mean, we certainly have Proverbs, but the Bible's so much more than that. And, we talk about in the Bible, you have indicatives and imperatives. And like the indicatives are the things that God is doing or has done. The Bible clearly states those things to us. And then it gives us imperatives, things that we must do based upon what God has done. And the Bible kind of deals with us that way, and it does it in very clear terms. Jesus says you cannot serve God and mammon. We're just faced with stuff like that. You can't be, even in Revelation, right? The church of Laodicea, you can't be neither hot or cold. You can't be in the middle. You have to either embrace or reject. Yeah. And the Bible really deals with us that way. And I think even like this, in something that a text like this that you go, well, it's not really, doesn't seem to be tugging at your heart that much or very emotional. It's just a narrative of what happened. But in the end there, when you see the way that Paul challenges us, the reader or the people in Galatia, but then us as readers here and saying, look, I'm not lying. And you go, wow, I have to make a choice. Is he or isn't he? It kind of just reminds you that once again, like, yeah, this is how we come at the Bible. We can't just like go halfway. Yeah. When Jesus says, calls them to drop their nets and follow, they don't know everything that Jesus is going to ask them to do. Yeah. Or how he's going to ask them to love him. But following Jesus is saying, no, I embrace it all. And I may not even like it when I figure out what you're asking me to do, but I'm going to love it in my soul because I know that it's the right thing. And I'm just going to embrace it, right?
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
I think another side note I thought of was like Paul has a really a fabulous testimony.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that I think a lot of times when you hear a lot of testimonies, you're like, that one's a good one. And
Yeah.
no, mine's okay.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I grew up in the church.
Right.
My family is mom and dad. They're believers. They raised us well. But I was thinking, like, what a shame it would be to discredit my own testimony because, like, is this a competition of sin?
Right.
Did the things that my flesh showed visibly before I came to Christ, am I winning?
Right.
But no, it is so beautiful how God has brought me this far, this long with Him.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
As Paul speaking.
Absolutely. It's a testimony that's that God preserved a life through a good family, through teaching early on, preserved a life from where it might have been absent of those things,
Yeah.
right? So it's an equally profound and compelling testimony. So, by the way, Paul grew up in the church too, you know. So,
Well, so,
I know what you're saying.
You know what I mean?
I do know what you're
Saul.
saying. Yes.
Killer of everyone. Just kidding.
Right. All right. Well, Angela, thank you for joining me here. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And God bless you this week as you head out into this week. And we'll see you next week at the same time. God bless. Bye.